The statement read before the House of Commons on the 22nd of March 1963 contained the following assurance: that there had been no impropriety whatsoever in the friendship between the Secretary of State for War and a young woman named Christine Keeler. It was delivered without hesitation. It was accepted without question. It was, in every particular, untrue. What the record would eventually establish, through the testimony of witnesses, the findings of official inquiry, and the resignation of a cabinet minister, was not merely that a lie had been told in Parliament, but that the conditions permitting that lie had been assembled over several years in full view of a society that preferred not to look directly at what it contained. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this. Now, let's begin. London in the early 1960s was a city in the slow process of becoming something it had not yet named. The austerity of the post-war years had not entirely lifted. Ration books had only ceased to be issued 8 years prior, and the bomb sites that still interrupted certain streets of the East End were not the consequence of neglect, but of pace, of a city growing faster than it could repair itself. Yet in Mayfair, in Belgravia, in the drawing rooms of the well-connected and the well-placed, the mood was one of comfort reassembled. The old hierarchies had survived the war and intended, it appeared, to survive whatever followed it. It was in this world, of country estates and West End clubs, of cabinet ministers and naval attachés, of osteopaths who moved among all ranks with equal facility, that the events this account examines first took shape. They took shape quietly, in the ordinary manner of arrangements among people who believed themselves beyond consequence. The inquiry that would eventually examine those events formally opened in the summer of 1963. Its findings would occupy 112 pages of official record. A government would not survive them. It was established, in the course of the inquiry conducted by Lord Denning in the summer and autumn of 1963, that the principal figures whose lives had intersected in the events under examination had arrived at that intersection by routes that bore no obvious resemblance to one another. John Dennis Profumo had been born on the 30th of January 1915. His family background was of Italian origin and considerable means. His father, a barrister, held the title of Baron Profumo of Italy, a title John would inherit upon his father's death in 1940. He had been educated at Harrow and at Brasenose College, Oxford. His military service during the Second World War had been distinguished. He had served with the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, had been mentioned in dispatches, and had risen to the rank of brigadier. He had entered Parliament as the member for Kettering in 1940, and had held his Stratford-upon-Avon seat from 1950 onwards. In 1960, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan had appointed him Secretary of State for War, a junior cabinet position, but one that placed him in the direct chain of command for military intelligence and national security matters. He had, in 1954, married Valerie Hobson, a well-regarded actress. Those who gave evidence concerning his character described him as charming, socially accomplished, and widely regarded as a candidate for future advancement within the Conservative government. Stephen Thomas Ward had been born on the 19th of October 1912 in Lemsford, Hertfordshire. His father was a Church of England clergyman, and his upbringing had been one of modest but respectable religious observance. He had been educated at Canford School in Dorset. In 1929, he had travelled to the United States to study osteopathy at Kirksville College of Osteopathic Medicine in Missouri, though his qualification was not completed until he returned to England and qualified formally in the late 1930s. His military service during the war had included a posting to India in 1944. Upon his return to civilian life, he had established a practice as an osteopath in London, and his professional network had expanded by the 1950s to encompass clients drawn from the highest reaches of political, social, and commercial life. He was known to the inquiry as both a social facilitator of considerable range and as the figure through whom the circumstances under examination had first been made possible. Christine Keeler had been born on the 22nd of February 1942 in Uxbridge, Middlesex. Her early life was materially difficult. Her father had left the family when she was young, and she had been raised by her mother in a converted railway carriage near Windsor. The inquiry established that she had left school without qualifications, had worked in a series of unskilled positions, and had eventually found employment at Murray's Cabaret Club in Soho, where she served drinks and appeared on stage. It was at that establishment, in approximately 1960, that she had first encountered Stephen Ward. It was subsequently determined, through the examination of witnesses and the reconstruction of movements, that the events which would eventually become a matter of parliamentary and national concern had their immediate origin in a weekend gathering at Cliveden, the country estate of Lord Astor in Buckinghamshire, over the 8th and 9th of July, 1961. Lord Astor and his wife had been hosting a house party at the main estate. Among their guests was John Profumo, attending with his wife Valerie. Stephen Ward, who held the tenancy of Spring Cottage within the grounds of the Cliveden estate, had been hosting a separate gathering at the cottage on the same weekend. Among Ward's guests was Christine Keeler and, it was established, Yevgeny Ivanov, a Soviet naval attaché then attached to the Soviet embassy in London. It was further established that on the evening of the 9th of July, Ward conducted his guests to the main house, where they were permitted use of the swimming pool. The party from the cottage was encountered there by Lord Astor and his guests. Stephen Ward introduced Christine Keeler to John Profumo in the course of that evening. The inquiry established that Profumo subsequently pursued an acquaintance with Christine Keeler, and that by the late summer of 1961, the two had entered into a sexual relationship. The duration of this relationship was determined to have been brief, several months at most, and it had been concluded before the end of 1961. The inquiry also established that Yevgeny Ivanov had, during the same period, been known to the British Security Service, MI5, as a suspected Soviet intelligence officer. The Security Service had made an approach to Stephen Ward in an attempt to use Ward's association with Ivanov as a means of obtaining intelligence, or of persuading Ivanov to change allegiance. This approach had not succeeded. The Security Service had also warned Ward, at some point in the summer of 1961, that Profumo's association with Christine Keeler, given her concurrent association with Ivanov, presented a potential security risk. The available record does not establish with certainty whether Ward conveyed this warning to Profumo, or whether Profumo received any direct communication from the Security Service to this effect. What the record does establish is that the relationship between Profumo and Keeler continued for a period after this warning had been issued. The matter entered the public record not through any deliberate disclosure, but through the consequences of a criminal proceeding entirely unrelated to the principal events under examination. On the 14th of December, 1962, a man named Johnny Edgecombe, a former associate of Christine Keeler's, arrived at a flat in Wimpole Mews, London, where Keeler was then residing. When he was refused entry, he discharged a firearm at the door. He was subsequently arrested and charged with offences arising from this incident. His trial was scheduled for the spring of 1963. When Christine Keeler was summoned to give evidence at the Edgecombe trial, she was absent. It was reported in the press that she had travelled to Madrid. The circumstances of her absence received coverage in several national newspapers, and in the course of that coverage, the details of her associations, including her prior relationship with John Profumo and her concurrent association with Yevgeny Ivanov, were introduced into public discussion. By March of 1963, questions had been raised in the House of Commons. On the 21st of March, the Labour member for Dudley raised the matter formally, inviting the Secretary of State for War to confirm or deny the rumours that had accumulated around his name. On the 22nd of March, 1963, Profumo rose before the House and made his statement. He denied any impropriety. He stated that he would not hesitate to issue proceedings for libel and slander if the allegations were repeated or reported. The Prime Minister and the Cabinet accepted the denial. Downing Street described the matter as closed. The security service had, by this point, already conducted its own assessment of the security implications of Profumo's association with Keeler. That assessment had concluded that no breach of national security had been established. Ivanov had been recalled to Moscow in December of 1962, before the matter had become publicly known. He did not return. The official record of these weeks is a document of what was not examined, what was not asked, and what was not disclosed. It is also, the inquiry would later determine, a record of what ought to have been all three. The formal examination of the events under review was conducted by Alfred Thompson Denning, Master of the Rolls, who was appointed by the Prime Minister in June of 1963 to inquire into the circumstances leading to the resignation of the Secretary of State for War and to determine whether any breach of national security had occurred or whether the circumstances gave rise to any other matter of public concern. Lord Denning examined 160 witnesses. He reviewed security service files, cabinet papers, personal correspondence, and the depositions given in the course of the ward proceedings. His report was completed and delivered to the Prime Minister in September of 1963. It was published on the 26th of that month. The report established the following determinations of fact. First, that John Profumo had lied to the House of Commons in his statement of the 22nd of March, 1963. This finding was not in dispute by the time the report was delivered, as Profumo had himself confirmed the fact of the lie in his resignation statement of the 5th of June. Second, that no breach of national security had been established as a consequence of his association with Christine Keeler. Third, that the security service had been aware of the potential risk presented by the overlap of associations as early as the summer of 1961, and that this awareness had not produced effective intervention. Fourth, that the handling of the matter by the Prime Minister and those advising him had been inadequate, that questions had not been asked with sufficient rigour, and that assurances had been accepted where investigation was required. The report's conclusions with respect to Stephen Ward were among its most contested findings. Ward had been charged in May of 1963 with living on the immoral earnings of Christine Keeler and others. He had stood trial at the Central Criminal Court in July and had been convicted on 2 of the counts against him. He had died before the verdict was formally pronounced, having taken a fatal overdose of sleeping tablets on the 31st of July, 1963. The report noted his role as a social intermediary of unusual range, without fully resolving the question of how much of what followed he had understood, anticipated, or arranged. If you are finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We also read every comment, so let us know your thoughts on this case below. Now, let's continue. Profumo's resignation from his position as Secretary of State for War was submitted on the 5th of June, 1963. His letter of resignation to the Prime Minister confirmed that his statement of the 22nd of March had been untrue in its denial of impropriety. He resigned from Parliament simultaneously. Harold Macmillan, then 70 years of age and in declining health, received the resignation and the confirmation of the lie with what those present described as visible distress. The trial of Stephen Ward opened at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, London, on the 22nd of July, 1963. The presiding judge was Mr. Justice Marshall. Ward faced 6 charges arising from allegations that he had lived on the immoral earnings of Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davis, 2 young women with whom he had maintained close association over several years. The prosecution presented testimony from Keeler and Rice Davis, both of whom gave evidence concerning payments and arrangements within Ward's household and social circle. Keeler confirmed under oath that she had been in a sexual relationship with John Profumo, thereby placing on the formal record what Profumo had denied before Parliament 3 months previously. Rice Davis, when informed in the witness box that Lord Astor had denied any sexual relationship with her, offered the observation that he would say that, would he not? A reply that passed immediately into common currency and has remained there since. The defense maintained throughout that Ward had not profited from immoral earnings, that the relationships in question had been personal rather than commercial, and that the prosecution had been constructed in the atmosphere of a public scandal, in which Ward had been selected as the figure upon whom official displeasure could be concentrated. Ward himself did not give evidence. Several witnesses who had been expected to speak in his support did not appear. Ward wrote letters during the trial to Harold Wilson and to others in public life, maintaining his innocence and identifying what he described as the real nature of what had occurred. These letters attracted some sympathy but produced no intervention. On the 31st of July, 1963, before the jury had returned its verdict, Ward was found unconscious at a friend's flat in London. He had taken an overdose of sodium phenobarbital. He did not recover consciousness. He died on the 3rd of August. The jury, informed of Ward's condition but directed to continue their deliberations, returned their verdict on the 31st of July. Stephen Ward was convicted on 2 counts of living on immoral earnings. He was not present to hear the verdict read. The sentence that would have followed it was never pronounced. What the official record contains after the events of the summer of 1963 is a sequence of formal consequences, set down with the economy appropriate to official documentation. Harold Macmillan resigned as Prime Minister in October of 1963, citing ill health. He had undergone surgery for a prostate condition, though the resignation was widely understood to have been accelerated by the damage the scandal had inflicted upon his government's authority. He was succeeded by Sir Alec Douglas Home. In the general election of October 1964, the Conservative government was defeated by Harold Wilson's Labour Party after 13 years in office. Whether the events of 1963 were a determining cause of that defeat, or merely a contributing factor among many, is a question the official record cannot settle. On the 6th of December 1963, Christine Keeler was sentenced to 9 months' imprisonment for perjury and related offences arising from her testimony in an unrelated matter. She had given false evidence in an attempt to secure the conviction of a former associate. She was released in May of 1964, having served 4.5 months. She married twice in subsequent years, had 2 children, and spent the greater part of her later life in circumstances that bore a painful resemblance to those of her childhood, in financial difficulty, in social housing, largely alone. She died on the 4th of December, 2017, at the age of 75. Yevgeny Ivanov was recalled to Moscow in December of 1962. He continued his naval career, serving with the Black Sea Fleet. His wife left him when the full circumstances of his London associations became publicly known. He did not remarry. He was found dead in his Moscow flat in 1994 at the age of 68. The official record contains very little concerning his later life. John Profumo retreated from public life entirely upon his resignation. He did not give interviews. He did not seek rehabilitation through the press. He took up voluntary work at Toynbee Hall, a charitable settlement in Whitechapel, East London, work that included, by his own account, cleaning lavatories. He continued in this work for 40 years. In 1975, he was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire for his charitable services. In 2006, at the age of 91, he died of a stroke. His wife Valerie had remained with him throughout. She had devoted herself similarly to charitable work until her death in 1998. The Denning Report, published in 1963, sold more than 100,000 copies on the day of its release, a figure without precedent for a government document of its kind. It was, among other things, a record of what a society will read when it believes itself to be reading the official version of its own private knowledge. What the inquiry could not record was simpler than any of its findings. A young woman had arrived in London without qualifications, without connections, without any resource beyond her own presence in a world that valued it briefly and discarded it without ceremony. The official proceedings that followed her brief intersection with power did not, in the main, concern themselves with what had become of her in the interval. The record opened when she became inconvenient, and closed when she was no longer so. That gap, between what the official record preserved and what it did not trouble itself to measure, is where the full account of these events still waits to be read.